Hi everybody, welcome back to English 247, and this is our class for Thursday, which happens to be July 1st. So now that we are in July, we are towards the ending of the semester, so I wanted to draw your attention to the notes below to talk a little bit about how we will be finishing up the semester. Our last formal class will be next week on Tuesday, and that is the 6th, where I will finish discussing incidents in the life of a slave girl, because I will begin it today. And we will also talk about the novella The Awakening. Then on Thursday, the 8th, by 9 a.m., if you can hand in your journal for both Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, that happens to be journal number 4, and also journal number 5, The Awakening. And certainly you can hand in your journals early, but since we're a little bit behind schedule, I thought I would give you up until the final exam. And on the 8th, that Thursday at 9 a.m. is when I am going to be posting our final exam. It's going to be an essay exam where you get to choose which essay questions to respond to, and you'll have 24 hours in which to do that. It'll be an open book, open note examination, so you can utilize things like journals and so forth. So what I will do is, if you submit in your journal for Incidents in the Awakening on Thursday at 9 a.m., I will try to get that back to you before the final exam will be due. That happens to be on the 9th, Friday at 9 a.m. And then I thought I could give us just a little bit of an extension on the final paper if it turns out that you need it. Paper number 2, though I always encourage early papers. The summer session ends on Monday, July 12th, so I can give you up until Monday, July 12th, to hand in your final paper, but that would be the very last time that you could hand in that particular final paper, midnight of that particular day. And then basically that concludes the semester. What I wanted to do today was to talk a little bit about some of my favorite passages in Jane Eyre, because for the last attendance question, I asked you to identify some of your favorite quotations in Jane Eyre, and then also review Emily Dickinson and talk a little bit about her poetry, and then introduce the idea of incidents in the life of a slave girl. So one of the things I enjoy about Jane Eyre is how deliberate it is in terms of its writing. There's lots of significance, for instance, with names, as I was discussing. But even in the very first sentence of the very first chapter, when it states there was no possibility of taking a walk that day, that basically establishes the mood and the theme about entrapment. And it's one of the things that we've been talking about over the course of the semester, is how female was oftentimes entrapped by society, and how these authors that we're reading are trying to find ways to escape, or at least question, that kind of entrapment. We know how important walks are when we read Persuasion. Chapter 2, when a young Jane Eyre says that she resisted all the way. That's also another theme we've seen over the course of the semester. It's this idea of resistance, and in fact, passive resistance is one of the things that we are going to be seeing in Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. How do you achieve freedom when you are entrapped? And we will see this in a very literal way in Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, though we've seen this in a symbolic way in many of the other texts that we've read thus far. And then in chapter 8, again, a very young Jane, and she happens to be talking to Helen Burns. At this point, we are now in Lowood. And she says that if others don't love me, I'd rather die than live. I cannot bear to be solitary and hated, Helen. Look here, to gain some real affection from you, or Miss Temple, or any other whom I truly love, I would willingly submit to have the bone of my arm broken, or to let a bull toss me, or to stand behind a kicking horse. And the response is, hush, Jane. You think too much of the love of human beings. You are too impulsive, too vehement. The sovereign hand that created your frame and put life into it has provided you with other resources than your feeble self, or creatures feeble as you. Besides this earth and besides the race of men, there is an invisible world and a kingdom of spirits. That world is round us, for it is everywhere. And those spirits watch us, for they are commissioned to guard us. And if we were dying in pain and shame, if scorn smote us on all sides, and hatred crushed us, angels, seeing our tortures, would recognize our innocence. And this is a very spiritual book, even though Jane Eyre is very critical of organized religion. It's something that we also will see in Emily Dickinson's writing, and the biography that I asked you to watch talked a little bit about how Dickinson rejected formal religion, but she embraced spirituality and saw religion within nature itself. And that's something that we have seen in Jane Eyre as well. In chapter 12, one of the things that I thought was interesting was the commentary about female that we were given. And Jane Eyre says, and this is now her at Thornfield when she is an adult, "It's vain to say human beings ought to be satisfied with tranquility. They must have action, and they will make it if they cannot find it. Millions are condemned to a stiller doom than mine, and millions are in silent revolt against their law. Nobody knows how many rebellions besides political rebellions ferment in the masses of life which people earth. Women are supposed to be very calm generally, but women feel just as men feel. They need exercise for their faculties and a field for their efforts as much as their brothers do. They suffer from too rigid a constraint, too absolute a stagnation, precisely as men would suffer. And it's narrow-minded in their more privileged fellow creatures to say they ought to confine themselves to making puddings and knitting stockings, to playing on the piano and embroidering bags." And this sentiment was something that was also expressed in Persuasion, but I don't think it was expressed quite as bluntly as it's expressed here in chapter 12 with Jane Eyre. And then as we continue on, we talk a little bit about how ultimately Jane Eyre is able to basically make commentary about Rochester's relationship, and that ultimately she understands that Miss Ingram doesn't have any kind of depth of character. And in fact, what she says, and this happens to be for me on page 188 or in chapter 18, that Miss Ingram was a mark beneath jealousy. She was too inferior to excite that feeling. I love the idea that Jane Eyre has such a strong sense of self-respect and esteem. She was showy, but she was not genuine. She was a fine person, many brilliant attainments, but her mind was poor, her heart barren by nature. Nothing bloomed spontaneously on that soil. No enforced natural fruit delighted by its freshness. She was not good. She was not original. And as she continues on, she talks about how Miss Ingram cannot charm Rochester, because if she had been a good and noble woman endowed with force and kindness and sense, I should have had one vital struggle with two tigers, jealousy and despair. Then my heart torn out and devoured. I should have admired her, acknowledged her excellence, and been quiet for the rest of my days. And the more absolute her superiority, the deeper would have been my admiration, the more truly tranquil. But as matters really stood, to watch Miss Ingram's efforts at fascinating Mr. Rochester, to witness their repeated failure, herself unconscious that they did fail, vainly fancying that each shaft launched hit the mark, and pluming itself on success when her pride and self-complacency repelled further and further what she wished to allure. To witness this was at once to be under ceaseless excitation and ruthless restraint, because when she failed, I saw how she might have succeeded. Arrows that continually glanced off Mr. Rochester's breast and fell harmless at his feet might, I know, if shot by a surer hand, in other words, she's talking about herself, have quivered keen in his proud heart, have called love into his stern eye. And of course, Jane dares to do this, even though, of course, they're different ages and they're different classes. So the idea of Jane's self-respect is what makes this novel, at least for me, so incredibly contemporary. And then, of course, there's that great gypsy scene where even Rochester acknowledges, under the guise of the gypsy, that Jane's brow seems to profess, "I could live alone if self-respect and circumstance require me to do so. I do not need to sell my soul to buy bliss. I have an inward treasure born with me, which can keep me alive if all extraneous delights should be withheld, or offered only at a price I cannot afford to give." The forehead declares reason sits firm and holds the reins, and she will not let the feelings burst away and hurry her to wild chasms. The passions may rage furiously, like true heathens as they are, and the desires may imagine all sorts of vain things, but judgment shall still have the last word in every argument, and the casting vote in every decision. One of the reasons why Rochester is so attracted to Jane is because he's able to appreciate her depth of character. That happens to occur in chapter 19. And then we know that Jane as an adult needs to return to Thornfield and confront Mrs. Reed and her former family. And I've always found the passage very interesting where we learn a little bit about what happens to Jane's cousins, Georgiana and Eliza, as adults. And this happens to be in chapter, well, it's on page 239 for me. And this chapter is one in which we see how Jane is able to compare herself. It's in chapter 21. Compare herself to her cousins. And Eliza says to her sister, Georgiana, Georgiana, more vain and absurd animal than you, was certainly never allowed to cumber the earth. You have no right to be born. Pretty harsh words. For you make no use of life. Instead of living for, in, and with yourself as a reasonable being ought, you seek only to fasten your feebleness on some other person's strength. And if no one can be found willing to burden her or himself on such a fat, weak, puffy, useless thing, you cry out that you are ill-treated, neglected, and miserable. I can't help but think of Mary, who's always talking about being ill-treated in Persuasion. Then, too, existence for you must be a scene of continual change and excitement, or else the world is a dungeon. You must be admired, you must be courted, you must be flattered, you must have music, dancing, society, or you languish, die away. And this is very typical of the world that we saw in Persuasion. And then Eliza continues, have you no sense to devise a system which will make you independent of all efforts and all wills but your own? Take one day, share it into sections, to each section apportion its task. Leave no stray unemployed quarters of an hour, 10 minutes, 5 minutes, include all. Do each piece of business in its turn with method, with rigid regularity. The day will close almost before you are aware it has begun, and you are indebted to no one for helping you to get rid of one vacant moment. You have had to seek no one's company, conversation, sympathy, forbearance. You have lived, in short, as an independent being ought. And this is, of course, the opposite extreme, and Jane rejects both. And that's the message to us as readers, that living life without any kind of vivacity or any kind of enthusiasm or energy, much like a St. John, isn't worth living. And in some respects, Helen too, as we know that Helen Burns is basically waiting for the afterlife. But of course, we don't want to be like an English Celine Varens. And this is when Jane, on page 274 in my version, says outright to Rochester that she will not be his English Celine Varens. This is in chapter 24. I will not be your English Celine Varens. I shall continue to act as Adele's governess. By that, I mean I shall earn my board and lodging and £30 a year besides. I'll furnish my own wardrobe out of that money, and you shall give me nothing but your regard. And if I give you mine in return, that debt will be quit. Again, incredibly modern idea, especially for this time period. And then, of course, we know that after Jane realizes the truth about Rochester, at one point she despairs, and she needs to find inner strength. And this is, for me, on page 322. This is where she's making the realization that she's going to have to leave Rochester, because that's the moral thing to do. It's in chapter 27. And she says, I care for myself. She's speaking to herself when she's tempted to basically be Rochester's mistress. The more solitary, the more friendless, the more unsustained I am, the more I will respect myself. I will keep the law given by God, sanctioned by man. I will hold to the principles received by me when I was sane and not mad, as I am now. Laws and principles are not for the time when there is no temptation, They are for such moments as this, when body and soul rise in mutiny against their rigor. Stringent are they, and if at my individual convenience I might break them, what would be their worth? They have a worth, so I've always believed, and if I cannot believe it now, it is because I am insane, quite insane, with my veins running fire and my heart beating faster than I can count its throbs. Again, incredibly modern. And I love the idea that Jane says, and this is in chapter 33, if no one would take me for love, I would not be regarded in the light of a mere money speculation. I do not want a stranger, unsympathizing alien different from me. I want my kindred, those with whom I have full fellow feeling. And this is in response to St. John's proposal to her. And again, we've seen this somewhat with Aunt Elliot, but not nearly as directly stated in Jane Eyre. So Jane Eyre is the longest text of the semester, so things move very quickly after Jane Eyre. What I had you do last class was to watch a biography entitled Voices and Visions, Emily Dickinson, that talks a little bit about Emily Dickinson's life and also talks a little bit about her poetry. There's some quotation from the poetry. Emily Dickinson being from Amherst, so she's local. One of the things that I've always thought about her poetry is that it both reveals and conceals. There's a great amount of paradox in her poetry. Her poetry is not particularly easy to read. Much of her poetry is autobiographical, and it talks about her inner emotional states, as the biography discussed. So it's not always easy, even for scholars and critics, to understand the meaning of her poetry, but that perhaps takes a bit of the stress off of us as reader to feel that we need to understand every word. I've often thought that Emily Dickinson is a master at being able to describe feelings. Perhaps she can do so in a way that no other writer has been able to do. And her writing being so unorthodox, I think also makes her a very interesting read for this semester. She basically defied many of the cultural and social expectations of her time. A woman of her class and education would be expected to marry and give dinner parties. Again, think of persuasion. And instead, she remains single. She has enough financial security through her father so that she can remain in her father's house. Basically isolates herself in her room in her adulthood and writes over 1,000 poems. So her unorthodox writing style with the irregular capitalization, she oftentimes likes to capitalize nouns, the use of dashes in places where we would oftentimes have commas, and a dash is just basically a longer pause than a comma would be. As the documentary had discussed, her poetry oftentimes follows church hymnals, and if you think about the ending of a line of a hymnal where you would need to have a long pause to take a breath so that you could continue on, and she mimics that style. And again, much in terms of her unorthodox writing, much of it is a critique of the societal standards of the time, which makes her a rebel. Not just in the way that she wrote, but also in the way that she could critique organized religion, even using the structure of a religious hymnal to talk about the beauty of nature and the spirituality of nature, not necessarily the spirituality of organized religion, was rather radical and bold. And her rhyme can be flexible. We don't necessarily have to have exact rhymes. Again, she likes to break convention. The patterns of those Protestant hymnals are probably one of the biggest ways that we can think about her trying to break convention in her poetry writing. And she talks about questions of the unknowable. She oftentimes talks about death from the perspective of death. Many times readers find her to be rather dark and depressing because she does talk about death, but she doesn't talk about death in a negative way. She oftentimes talks about it as a positive, in that it's just merely a stepping stone, so to speak, until the next life, the afterlife. And if she's writing from the perspective of death, she's writing about death as if she actually is dead herself, that she knows more about the afterlife than even religious authorities. So again, that shows her rather defiant and unconventional nature. So there's paradox and contradiction. Think about something like the woe of ecstasy, where woe is filled with darkness and sadness, and ecstasy is filled with delight and happiness. It's something that's very common with Emily Dickinson. And while her poetry is very personal to her own experiences and feelings, it's also very universal because we've all probably felt loneliness and love and questioning of the universe, and that is what she examines both in her writing and also in her letters as well. We're not necessarily reading her letters at this particular point in time, but the documentary talked about how her prose, her sentences in her letters could be just as complex as and also challenging as her verse, her poetry itself. Some of the themes you're going to find in her poetry: loss, love, religion, nature, loneliness, defiance, again, timeless and universal concerns. Over 1,700 poems, actually, and they are highly compressed. Poems tend to be. None of them were given titles. She was writing them mostly for herself, as the documentary discussed, and basically kept them bound in drawers. And it was only after her death that her sister basically had these poems published, and unfortunately an editor went and standardized things like punctuation and spelling, which completely changed the tenor of her poetry. And it was really only until the 1950s or so where an editor by the name of Johnson, and that was the text that I had ordered for this class, if you had purchased the text for this class, published her poems in their original form with their dashes and the irregular capitalization, that her poetry became interesting to scholars and critics because of the way that she was defying convention. So in terms of finding Emily Dickinson poetry, you need to be careful that you're reading the original and not the edited version. And the quickest way to check on that is just to look to see if the poem has dashes at the ending of lines. Because if you've got commas instead, then what you are probably reading is the edited version and not the original version. So she went to Mount Holyoke, so right in the neighborhood here, and you can visit if you so wanted, or I believe it's now open, the Emily Dickinson Homestead, now that things are beginning to reopen after COVID. I'm not certain if the museum is open or not, but it does bear looking into, because if it's not open, I know it will be shortly as things are opening up. And I've included the website for that so that you can actually view her house if you went on a museum tour. And, you know, I think about Emily Dickinson oftentimes in terms of not entire poems, but lines, a section that has a particular meaning to you. One line that I love from one of her poems, and it's a line that's been quoted oftentimes in things like GCC graduations, is, "I dwell in possibility. I dwell in possibility." And it works very nicely for something like a milestone event, like a graduation. I think it very much explains in just 4 words what exactly students are doing as they're pursuing an education. It's all about the future and possibility. But I love the idea of dwelling, because you can think of dwell as a homestead, but you can also think of dwell in terms of thinking about something obsessively. So it can be more negative and it can also be more positive, and that's very typical of Emily Dickinson. I wanted to share one poem with you with Emily Dickinson, and your attendance question is going to be for you to share a poem with the class and talk about why you want to share it. You don't necessarily have to explain the poem. It's just talking a little bit about why it happened to capture your interest. Again, I don't expect you to read 1,700 poems, so you can just sort of go through and leaf through the Johnson text if you'd like, and there are multiple websites that you can also just skim through. You might have your own Emily Dickinson poem already that you are fond of, or perhaps you find interesting to share. And my hope is that when you read your peers' attendance question responses, in addition to listening to my poem, and the poem that I'm going to be selecting is Because I Could Not Stop Her Death, then at least you'll have some exposure to a handful of Emily Dickinson poems, in addition to what the autobiography, or what the biography talked about, I should say. And if you'll note, there is no journal for Emily Dickinson, because I thought that at this particular point in the semester, just sort of sharing the poems that spoke to you would be enough. But if you wanted to earn a slight bit of extra credit, you can always hand in a journal on Emily Dickinson. Keep in mind, you do have to hand in a journal for incidents in the life of a slave girl, and also hand in a journal for The Awakening. My suspicion is that most of you will write paper number 2 on either Jane Eyre, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, or Persuasion, all of them being novels or novella. You do have the option of writing on Emily Dickinson, but just note that writing on a poem is a different kind of exercise. You don't want to give a very a kind of superficial response to Emily Dickinson. So if you were going to write about her, you'd probably want to focus on 1 or 2 of her poems in depth. And I can give you a small example of how to go about doing that as I discuss the poem Because I Could Not Stop for Death. And I've given a link for that where you can find that online, thepoetryfoundation.org, which is a very good site for finding poetry, and they have quite a few Emily Dickinson poems there if you wanted to look at that site to select your poem for today's attendance question. And I usually recommend that when you're reading a poem, you read it 3 times. The first, just to try to get an overall sense of the poem. The second, so that you can begin a more in-depth analysis. And the third, so that you can kind of review. And poetry is meant to be musical. There's an oral element to it. I encourage you to read the poems out loud or to listen to somebody else reading the poetry. So if you've ever gone to a poetry reading, you know that there are professionals who basically specialize in reading poetry so that you can begin to hear some of the rhythms. In some ways, it's very much like a song. And I think of song lyrics as perhaps being our closest modern day equivalent to poetry itself. And she didn't title any of her poems again because she was writing them for herself. So we refer to her poems by the first line. And the poem reads, because I did want to read it to you. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill. For only gossamer, my gown, my tippet, only tulle. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, a cornice in the ground. Since then 'tis centuries, and yet feel shorter than the day. I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. And notice how I'm reading that line, or that Y sound at the ending of that last line, eternity, slightly oddly, so that I can keep a sense of rhyme here. And one of the things that you can do when you're reading a poem is to explicate or explain the major elements of the poem by going through it line by line, word by word, even piece of punctuation by piece of punctuation. And if you're looking at the text for Because I Could Not Stop for Death, you will see that it is divided up into sections that look almost like paragraphs. Those sections are called stanzas in a poem, and they serve the same function as a paragraph. They basically are dealing with one topic. So when you move to a new stanza, that indicates a shift to a new topic. And I wanted to begin with the first stanza, Because I Could Not Stop for Death. So there's a very personal poem where she's talking about herself, the I, and also this idea of death, which is capitalized, which personifies death, which gives death very human characteristics. The idea that death has the power to stop, not humans. In other words, death decides when to take us. We don't get to decide when to die. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. Now, we don't usually think of death in the positive, but the first word we have to describe death is kind. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. And this is an old idea that life is a kind of journey, and we are basically traveling in a kind of carriage, if you will, through our time in life. And basically when you die, or it's time for you to die, you die alone. So this is why the carriage held just ourselves, death and I. and immortality, and the idea that one of the reasons why death is kind, because death brings immortality, everlasting life. We slowly drove, he knew no haste. Death is usually referred to as a male, and the idea of haste is something that is in the human realm, not necessarily in the spiritual realm. This is why they knew no haste, because there is no time in the afterlife. So they slowly drove. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too, for his civility. So now death has been called kind and civil, and labor and leisure are again human elements. And labor is one of the reasons why we need leisure. If there is no labor, there's no need for leisure. None of this exists in the afterlife. It's a completely different realm of existence. And now our third stanza. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. So this is supposed to represent basically youth. And notice that just because a line ends, that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to pause. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring, or I could read this, we passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring, because there is no punctuation after the word strove, so I can go on to the next line. And youth, recess, the idea of fun in the ring. If you know anything about the childhood game, Ring Around the Rosie, which actually happens to be about death and plague. We passed the fields of gazing grain. So working in the fields, gazing grain, this is supposed to represent adulthood. This is the time of work. We passed the setting sun. Setting sun is supposed to represent the ending of life, old age. There's a long tradition of using the times of day to represent stages of life. So sunrise would be the beginning of life, and noon would be the height of life, and evening would be the beginning of descent of life, and then nighttime would be old age or the ending of life. So we passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill. They basically are leaving the human realm and going into the afterlife, a completely other realm. The dews drew quivering and chill. If there is no sun, is beginning to get rather cool. For only gossamer, my gown, my tippet only tulle. The idea is that temperature is also related to the human realm, not necessarily the afterlife. So her gown is only made out of gossamer, which is a very thin fabric. Oftentimes it's associated with fairy tales. And the same with tulle. It's a fabric that's used for things like wedding veils and tutus and things of that nature. A tippet is basically a shawl. So she's wearing a very thin fabric, even though it's cold outside, but she doesn't need clothing as protection. And we assume the I is the she, but the I could refer to any individual on their journey towards the afterlife. And this sense of clothing is, again, a human construct that we wear either for protection against the elements or we wear for social convention. Again, none of this is going to be necessary, where she's wearing this very thin gossamer fabric that you could see through, in effect. That's what gossamer is. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. House is capitalized, so there are lots of possibilities of what that house might be. It could be the house of God. That could be a church, for instance. It could be a cemetery, or a crypt, which is now going to be her new home. It could be a representation of heaven, the house of the afterlife. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The house is so far away, you can't really see it. It just seems like it's a swelling in the ground. The roof was scarcely visible. You can barely see the roof, it was so far away. The cornice, which happens to be an architectural element in a roof, in the ground. Again, it's so far away that you could barely see, so this is part of what they were passing. Since then, 'tis centuries. In other words, all of this happened centuries ago, so she's speaking from the perspective of the afterlife. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day. Because again, time is a human construct. It isn't necessarily a construct in the afterlife. Where I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. And of course, horses' heads would be the horses that would be pulling the carriage that she's riding in. But horses' heads is also a biblical reference when we talk about the horsemen of the apocalypse, which is supposed to represent the ending of the world when all of us will be in the afterlife. And that the afterlife brings eternity, and that's why ultimately death is kind and death is civil, because immortality comes with death. It's nothing to fear, but it's something to embrace. And it's also proof of the afterlife if she's speaking from the afterlife. Not proof that you would find in the human construct of a pulpit where you would have a minister talking about an afterlife, but no proof necessarily to give to the congregation. In this poem, if she's speaking from the perspective of afterlife, then this is the proof of afterlife. So I very much like this particular poem. One of the reasons why is I understand this poem, I'll be honest with you, oftentimes it's not easy to understand Emily Dickinson's poetry. Again, she's talking about inner states and inner emotions that oftentimes can seem very confusing when they are in black and white in print. If you find yourself experiencing that, again, I encourage you to just take a line. Or another one of my favorite lines from Emily Dickinson is, one need not be a house to be haunted. One need not be a house to be haunted. And I think that's just a wonderful line about the idea of what it means to be haunted inwardly as opposed to the idea of the outward haunting when we think of ghosts and spirits. So I look forward to reading the poems that you select. Again, you just have to choose one and tell us a little bit about why you chose that poem. If you can provide a link to that poem, if you can find it online, that would be very nice, but not necessary. You can tell us just a little bit about the poem if necessary. And the next text that we're working with, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, it doesn't have the kind of literary complexity of the text that we've been reading thus far, because basically what we have is Harriet Jacobs, a slave writing under the pseudonym of Linda Brent. The idea that she could read and write, excuse me, that was my piece of paper that ended up flying because of the fan. But the fact that she could read and write, which would have been illegal for a slave, in and itself is remarkable. And while her writing might not have literary sophistication, there are still literary elements within her writing that I will talk about next class. So I've always thought that her text has many elements that are literary, but from a historical perspective, her text is incredibly important. Thus far, we've been reading pieces of fiction that are supposed to emulate real life, but now we've got the story of a real person, and it's hard to believe that this is all in the same time period, that you can have a Victor Frankenstein and an Anne Elliot, and even a Jane Eyre and an Emily Dickinson, who are living in such privilege and comfort at the same time when we've got a society of slavery where people are being tortured and killed. And what I think makes Harriet Jacobs or Linda Brent's novel or tale so interesting is that not only do we get a slave narrative, but we get a female slave narrative. So there's an additional level of complexity. If you know Spanish, by the way, you might know that Linda means pretty in Spanish, linda, and I think that's one of the reasons why she chose that pseudonym. And also the idea that I think there's a distancing effect. It must be incredibly difficult to have to recollect the incredible savagery and brutality that she had to experience, and perhaps by giving herself another name, she can distance herself a bit. This female slave narrative talks about the hardships of slaves, especially the hardships of female slaves, and also calls for reform. And she talks about that was her primary motivation. She wasn't writing to profit. She wasn't writing to entertain. She wanted specifically to reform. And in addition to that agenda, what we also see is her writing under the conventions of the 19th century sentimental novel, where we're talking about the importance of decorum. And we've talked about this a little bit in Jane Eyre and Anne Elliot. If If you remember one passage in Jane Eyre where Jane has to be instructed on how to be in the room before Rochester and his friends enter, so she doesn't have to bother with a formal entrance. And we know this from Anne Elliot in Persuasion, how important it is to keep up convention. But we see this on a completely different level in the slave narrative. The importance of virginity for female, and also virtue under siege for female slave. And what we see her engage in is a passive and also an active resistance, but that her passive resistance is active resistance by her remaining true to her oneself and maintaining her self-respect. It's one thing for a fictional character like Jane Eyre to say, I respect myself. It's quite another for a Harriet Jacobs or a Linda Brent to be self-respecting in a society and a world that does not offer self-respect. It's also a novel where we see some female bonding, which is going to be very important. The relationship between Harriet Jacobs or Linda Brent and her grandmother. Once again, we have another narrative where the mother is not present, so the grandmother is taking the place of the mother. And these seemingly impossible events are verified by scholarship, that what she is describing is indeed true, and it seems almost impossible that she could have lived under this level of hardship, but that's exactly what happened. And if you know anything about slavery, then you know that there are many stories of slaves that have existed in seemingly impossible situations of cruelty and brutality. And this text also shows the power of reading and writing, in that not only do we see her use of language and her ability to read and write to try to enact social change, but we see how frightening reading and writing and education is to those in power, because they made it illegal for slaves to be able to access that, because the power of reading and writing meant the power of communication. And once you have the power of communication, you have the power to enact social change. This is both a sweet and bitter tale. You want to think about it that way. If you've ever heard the word bittersweet, we talked a little bit about paradoxes and contradictions with Emily Dickinson's writing, but we'll definitely see that in Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And I forewarn you that some of the passages are quite brutal and horrific, but they also are real, unfortunately, and important to understand in terms of our history, which means that we get to understand our present and hopefully can change our future. So we see a woman in a male society, a slave in a free society, and someone who's black in a white society, which I will continue to discuss next class, and then finish up with The Awakening, Kate Chopin's novella, which was considered to be so scandalous because it so directly addressed female sexuality that she was basically blacklisted from her career. And while we saw her perhaps sort of suggesting this in The Story of an Hour, it is front and center in The Awakening, that this is not just a spiritual or intellectual or emotional awakening, it's also a physical awakening for this female character, Edna Pontellier. So this is how we will end next class. But again, for today's attendance question, which I would ask you to respond to on our discussions board by Friday, the 2nd of July at 9 a.m., to identify one Emily Dickinson poem, or even a section of a poem, such as a line or two, that you find to be particularly powerful, and explain why. So I hope you're doing well, I'm doing well, and we will finish up next class. Take care, bye-bye.